Thanks, Sam, and thank you everyone for joining this session. As Sam said, my name is Joseph, based here in Brisbane, and yeah, we'll be just tackling a lot of different questions and ideas, obviously surrounding virtual volunteering, and kind of giving a broad overview of how to utilize this method of operation, obviously activating the youth sector in terms of nonprofit engagement. So the question, obviously, at the start that we have to answer is why youth? And a lot of people, especially in the nonprofit world, especially with established organizations, often ask this question. And how do we really utilize young people in terms of fundraising? So youth are actually often considered as the leaders of tomorrow, and most people kind of group young people in that category. Um, but I like to say that youth are actually the emerging leaders of today, mainly because the youth sector, especially in Australia, actually represents 13% of the population and accounts for almost 3.3 million people locally. So it's quite a big percentage of the population, and in this regard, has to be taken seriously. This demographic actually has quite a lot of potential to engage within the sector, and especially young people have so many great ideas, but often lack the recognition or the potential to utilize these ideas in the mainstream economy. So, as a response to obviously the challenge of how do we utilize the resources and skills of young people, my organization, ReachAcross, launched this project called Solve Squad, which at the start of last year, 2020, when everyone started obviously being affected by COVID-19 on a larger, widespread scale. So we were trying to figure out how do we really utilize the skills of young people during this crisis, this global crisis. So our COVID-19 response was launching this project, and it's basically an online platform, not just for young people, but for anyone from the nonprofit or fundraising sector in general who want to utilize virtual volunteering as a viable initiative within their own organization. So basically, we partner with collaborating organizations. We started first of all here in Australia, and then we started expanding globally once we realized that the pandemic was affecting everyone in similar ways. You know, a lot of organizations, especially nonprofits, were isolated or they didn't have the means or resources or opportunities to engage within the sector, mainly because they either didn't have the capacity or the resources to do that. So we wanted to provide an online platform to connect people in that regard. So we started basically with small grassroots organizations. One of our first ones is actually a hospitality based small business, and then we started expanding obviously across the sector. So from everything from the Kindness Project, who a lot of people may have heard about in social media, when people do random acts of kindness or drop groceries at people's doorsteps or things like that. So everything from those sorts of small organization level initiatives to the United Nations, who launched their COVID-19 youth platform, which we've partnered with as well. So it's been very interesting to see how many organizations, especially nonprofit initiatives, have kind of gravitated towards virtual volunteering. And we basically do it or approach it in two ways. One, individuals can sign up to our platform, solvesquad.co, and basically list their skills, their talents, and obviously their availability. And then we connect them to organizations within their field. So, for example, a fundraising professional who wants to upskill and work with more of a global organization in a different country can sign up using our platform, and then we connect them to organization either within the country or even sometimes within their own city. and then basically manage that relationship remotely. So we've been able to kind of tap into different markets that way. And outside of Australia, we've been very active in Europe, the US, and also South Asia, and looking to expand to other countries as well. So Solve Squad, obviously, the way that we started it or kind of launched it globally was through the World Economic Forum. For those of you who don't know, the World Economic Forum was started by an economics professor called Karl Schwab in Switzerland as basically a way to connect people globally for more public-private cooperation. So um, basically think of young professional hubs. So the Global Shaper hubs or communities started popping up in different cities around the world. Um, from memory, there's about 400 hubs now in over 150 countries, and I've been involved with my local hub here in Brisbane. And usually, we're given one project a year um, in which we have to launch an innovative initiative for a social challenge or issue. Obviously, COVID happening, we obviously wanted to respond in that way, and that's how Soul Squad was born. So, as I mentioned, there's two ways people can get involved, either as a volunteer looking for opportunities or as an organization looking for volunteers. So we utilize the virtual volunteering model, which I will explain more in detail in a few moments. But basically, we wanted to create this two-way street in a sense where people could connect with organizations outside of their network and obviously connect with initiatives that they wanted to be either partnering with or opportunities that they wanted to upskill their current skills or interests. So we basically facilitate the matching process with our platform. So how did it all begin? A lot of people often ask me when I talk to them about Soul Squad or fundraising in general, has virtual volunteering been around for a long time, or is it kind of a new or modern phenomenon? So actually, virtual volunteering or e-volunteering, as it used to be called, was started in the late 90s. So it was first started by Impact Online, which is basically has now rebranded as Volunteer Match, which most of you might know. So it's one of the first organizations. There were others such as Project Gutenberg that started utilizing volunteering online, and then kind of expanded across the US at the time, and then obviously globally has become adapted by different organizations. So the United Nations started something called the United Nations Volunteering Online Initiative, and I believe they have about 1 billion volunteers worldwide, which they have interacted with since starting the virtual volunteering adaptation. So there are different opportunities that people usually list on these websites, such as Volunteer Match, and people can basically sign up or access it that way. And in addition to just facilitating the process, there's often a online mentoring component. There are ways that you can get involved or lead to paid opportunities, and I'll get into that as we dive in. So the question also pops up often when dealing with virtual volunteering. Does it help organizations, especially when it comes to fundraising, or is it more of a hindrance? I tend to say it depends. Um, Often, if you go into utilizing virtual volunteering and you don't really understand the concept, or you're struggling to adapt it to your organization, maybe your organization has been around for quite some time and is resistant to change, or if you're looking into using virtual volunteering in the midst of a crisis, it's often hard to implement it effectively if you don't know exactly what you're doing or you don't have the tools and resources at hand. So with the emphasis obviously on the pandemic, the question arises, how does this solve unemployment? How does this raise funds from a nonprofit perspective? How do we really utilize it effectively in the sector? So if you think of it as a vehicle, volunteering is basically a vehicle that takes you from one point A to one point B. And it depends obviously on your organization, what you're trying to do, but using it as a way to bounce back in a sense can be effective. It's not to say that virtual volunteering is a short-term solution, but it is an effective way, and time has proven this. It is an effective way to get skilled volunteers into your organization to assist you during a period of transition. And for the nonprofit community, this is especially helpful when building connections, partnerships, and obviously expanding your organization beyond just a countrywide focus. So fundraising using this model is basically an approach that people are utilizing right now. So the state of the economy, as I mentioned, with new jobs and upskilling, and obviously creating platforms for change, there's a lot of things that people have to take into consideration when considering the global pandemic. So with fundraising, it's more of a need than an option, and especially for organizations wanting to increase their funds over time, right? So to meet this need, this virtual volunteering model has been employed, and it's beginning to become more utilized, not just in the nonprofit sector, but also in corporate organizations. So, for example, we've been collaborating with PwC, one of the big four. They launched their platform Project Spirit, which is a 100% volunteer platform where people, even outside of the organizational, the corporate world, can post their opportunities. People can sign up to assist with certain projects. They can pick their timings. They can even choose how long they can dedicate, obviously, their skills and resources to the project, and then basically determine the outcomes from there. So it's becoming more of a mainstay. And I think when you consider it in light of fundraising and how do we utilize this model effectively, it begs the question, can we really take advantage of the trend as well? So continuing with this idea of utilizing a young workforce, it's crucial for organizations to obviously consider new ideas and resources. And I know for more established nonprofits, this can be a challenge, especially when you're thinking about or considering the way things have always been done. And I talk to organizations all the time where they're like, where the reason we've existed is because we haven't changed with passing trends. Or when it comes to the nonprofit field, is this a short-term solution to a long-term issue? So I think when it comes to obviously utilizing the virtual volunteering model, it also boils down to employee engagement. And I see one of the questions from Phil, how can I assess the skills of volunteers online? That's actually a great question. And using platforms, I think, where it utilizes virtual volunteers that actually sign up to sites. You can, review their CVs. You can ask them direct questions. You can start connections with them, kind of like LinkedIn for volunteers, where you can interact with them before you recruit them to your organization. I think those kind of initial connections can help. And I will be sharing a list of resources later on in the presentation of how to kind of assess those skills of volunteers. But great question. Um, and it's a great segue actually to the last question on the slide. How does one acquire new skilled and young workers? So I think getting ahead of the curve is crucial. And what I mean by that is with the current state of affairs with COVID, we're certainly not out of the woods. And there's still a lot of issues and challenges to consider when working in the nonprofit sector. Some of these might be how do I engage with people beyond the workplace relationship when volunteers aren't in a physical location? So when you're working with volunteers, perhaps in another country, there's time zones that have to be considered, different changes when it comes to cultural and language barriers. There might be a certain understanding when you begin a project or initiative that if there's certain targets that change over time, how do you meet that demand? So there's different questions, and all of these have to be considered when you start utilizing such a model as virtual volunteering. But I think because time is a commodity that we all have now with the pandemic, with flexible work arrangements and new opportunities on the horizon, and obviously changing conditions for people who are working within the sector, I think having more of an impact in that leads to using virtual volunteering as a better vehicle, as I mentioned, for reaching those goals or targets that you have as an organization. So taking advantage of that during the current time is one way to stay ahead of the curve. And obviously, we'll dive into some of those questions in a few moments. So, using a homegrown example, there was a video I was going to share, but based on the success of the last video, I think we'll pass it for now. But I will include the link in the chat. But basically, Volley is a platform that Solve Squad has been utilizing in my own organization as a way to get volunteers, talented, valued young volunteers from different parts of the country, even internationally. So Volley is actually a B Corp, a benefit corporation that started here in Australia, and it's basically a platform where organizations can post projects, initiatives, requirements for certain fundraising goals or requirements that you might have for a project. Or a challenge that you might have within an organization. So, for example, if you have a fundraising goal that you have to meet before the financial year and you need a social media specialist or a digital marketer to obviously launch your marketing campaign or a fundraising campaign, you can sign up your site to Volley and basically get matched to a number of different volunteering candidates. You can download their CVs. You can connect with them via LinkedIn. You can start a conversation with them offline, and basically choose however many volunteers that you need for that project, and then basically connect with them virtually. So this model that Volley has been using they actually started using virtual volunteering over 10 years ago, so pre-pandemic, and according to social impact assessments, they've saved over $1 million worth of overhead for organizations, especially nonprofit organizations, um, using the virtual volunteering model. So we've partnered officially with Volley through one of their co-founders, Matthew Boyd, who has been utilizing student workforces, especially international students have been affected a lot during the pandemic. So universities such as RMIT, the University of Melbourne, other universities around the country in regional areas as well have been utilizing Volley, and it's a great platform for collaborating with different organizations, everyone from the Australian government to corporate partners to organizations such as Thank You have been utilizing Volley as a way to get talented volunteers in this regard. So it's a great way to check out the platform, and you can check it out in the chat link as well. So I will just skip this video. So basically, how do we utilize this from a fundraising perspective is a question that you might have. Um, Even if it isn't, I'll kind of cover it quickly as we go along, because I think it's important to consider when you're thinking long term. So when you're sourcing volunteers virtually, as I mentioned, for your project or platform, you have to consider using technologies that you might not have utilized before. So, remote teams, so using platforms such as Zoom has become commonplace. There are other platforms that you can utilize, such as Campfire. Um, People use Salesforce or Slack to keep in contact with people from a payroll perspective, or kind of collaborating using virtual teams to open communication channels a bit more effectively. You can use other platforms such as Insightly to maintain an online database. So there's different ways that you can obviously engage remotely. Um, when it comes to impact or measuring impact over time, as I mentioned, Volley does offer services to kind of track that from the time that you start utilizing volunteers via their platform to the time when you finish your project or fundraising target. So there are ways to measure that impact over time as well. Um, Recently, I was introduced to an organization that we've just started collaborating with called Impaction, based in California. So Shivani, the co-founder, basically introduced me to an organization called Altruis, which is an app which you can utilize to basically track volunteer hours. You can track your impact. The volunteers, from their perspective, can see how they're utilizing their time for different projects or organizations. So it's a really great tool to utilize when you're kind of tracking long-term investment into employees or volunteers, especially. Generating new leads for fundraising through volunteers. Obviously, when you're utilizing, young professionals, they have their own networks, they have their own platforms which they utilize. So how can we kind of tap into those resources? And I think young professionals, especially, they're very open to that, to sharing those leads or opportunities. So that's one advantage of utilizing a younger workforce. Also, it's a way to collaborate beyond your specific network. So, if you're looking to collaborate more within a certain sector, suppose obviously you're engaging with people within a country, but you want to expand globally, virtual volunteering helps in that regard. A lot of young founders are more open to collaboration in comparison with more established organizations. So this might be used to your advantage when you're utilizing virtual volunteering. Um, there are a lot of pro bono organizations, such as the Virtual Volunteering Project, pro bono lawyers. There are a lot of online mentoring platforms that kind of help you navigate this space as well. And because everyone's working volunteering or adapting using this virtual volunteering model, it doesn't come at any cost to you. So that's one of the advantages, obviously, of using virtual volunteering. So there are a lot of ways to think outside of the box and utilize these platforms. And it just basically takes setting aside either a point person or someone within your organization who's really passionate about this, or driving this forward, that basically gets you ahead of the curve when it comes to virtual volunteering within your own organization. So moving on, basically continuing this concept beyond just the bottom line. So a lot of big organizations, as I mentioned, are quite resistant to change. So when it comes to utilizing virtual volunteering, they often ask, how does this affect me financially? Is it a plus point? Can I utilize this long term? Obviously, do certain parts of my business model have to be sacrificed in order pivot to meet this demand or this technology? So these are all valid questions. I think it definitely depends on your perspective. So when it comes to having a greater impact, obviously virtual volunteering can have a great advantage. As I mentioned earlier, it's a unique opportunity where people can kind of utilize this model long term. And tying into the bounce back theme that we have at the conference, um, a crisis such as a global pandemic has brought to light that we have to adapt to change. It's no longer an option. It's more of a reality that has to be considered. And for nonprofits, that's it's been a really big challenge for people to adapt in the middle of a crisis, but it's something that we have to consider obviously long term. Um, and a lot of organizations have been utilizing this for quite some time, so it's been easier to adapt. For newer organizations, if you don't have the bandwidth or the capacity to do that, it can be more of a long term issue. But obviously, if you have a young professional who's willing to kind of take the lead within your organization, or if you recruit someone using the virtual volunteering model outside of your organization as a consultant or a contractor, or even someone you can take on or bring onto your team. If you have a business development team or a strategic fundraising team that's looking outside of more established models or traditional models of fundraising, this can be a great model to kind of utilize for the long term. So basically, take it as a blessing in disguise. I think a lot of people see the pandemic as something to be avoided at all costs. Obviously, if we had the opportunity to start over, no one would wish on their worst enemy that COVID affected them directly. So obviously, with the pandemic as it is today, we have to adapt and pivot to the changes that have occurred within the sector. And utilizing it to the best of our ability is definitely something that we have to take on board as fundraising professionals. And I will be using more of a real case scenario that we've utilized in our organization in a few moments to kind of illustrate this point further. But utilizing young professionals, I think, is more of an advantage than a disadvantage. Um, the common saying that time is money often doesn't apply nowadays because everyone has the same amount of time, but perhaps less money or resources to make things happen. Um, so using ideas to make money is more of a reality than using time as a way to make money. So what I mean by that is kind of thinking creatively to meet the demand as a result of the pandemic or the crisis that we find ourselves in is definitely something that fundraisers have to consider more often. And with the changing workforce, and obviously, a lot of organizations shutting down because they haven't been able to meet the demand. It's something that we have to consider more seriously. And then when it comes into um, the idea or the mind space or headspace where how can we utilize this more effectively post pandemic? It's something that Solve Squad, my organization, has been considering as well. Obviously, once the pandemic kind of runs its course, or with the introduction of the vaccine and things that are changing now, how do we kind of engage with people long term or sustainably? Um, and one of the questions I see in the chat is how do we keep volunteers engaged after the fact? That's also a great question. I think it comes down to employee engagement, as I mentioned before. So, how do we kind of create a pipeline of opportunities or an environment um, from a remote or virtual perspective that keeps people engaged? I think giving opportunities to people to kind of have enough bandwidth or capacity to do things their way. I know it's a risk when it comes to people who you are employing for the first time or recruiting volunteers. You're not sure how long they're going to stay with your organization or if they're going to, leave you hanging in the wind. These are all obviously questions that you have to consider. But with any new employee, I think it's creating that environment where people feel valued, their ideas are taken on board or at least considered. Um, and if people, obviously have platforms or opportunities where they want to offer that as a proposal to your organization, whether they're employed by your organization or not, it's definitely food for thought. So I think when volunteers want to kind of stay with your organizations after a project has run its course or you've met your timeline, it's definitely something that you can consider when it comes to long term. But obviously, when you use platforms like Solve Squad or Volley, as I mentioned earlier, usually it's on a set timeline. So if you have a project that's running for 6 months or a campaign that's running for less than that, um, basically the understanding that you can kind of enter into with a virtual volunteer is once the project or initiative has run its course, that's usually the end of it, unless both of you are satisfied and want to take it forward. In which case, you can obviously kind of discuss that with the organization or the volunteer directly. But great question. So, as I mentioned, using a real example, my organization ReachAcross, which kind of handles Solve Squad as a direct initiative of our nonprofit. Like all organizations last year, we were dealing with COVID. How do we put on fundraising events? And my organization, although it's an international nonprofit, each branch office or head office kind of operates independently based in the country of operation. So we launched Reach Across Brisbane only 2 years ago at the end of 2019. And at the time, we were thinking about how do we kind of adapt to meet the challenge of COVID. Um, so basically, we were thinking about having a fundraising dinner, which most organizations usually have annual fundraising dinners. But for us, it was the first time we were running it. So we decided, instead of having a virtual event or kind of postponing it to after the pandemic, we decided to actually take advantage of the opportunity because unlike most organizations or government initiatives or even NGOs that were more established, they were canceling all of their organizations' events because of COVID. So we actually had an event calendar that was pretty much open and event venues that didn't have any bookings and people offering you know their spaces left and right. So we actually got to partner with the Queensland government, which is the state government here in my state. They had one of their biggest venues, Queensland Multicultural Centre, that can seat about up to 1,000 people within the auditorium, which we had at a discounted rate because of COVID. So we actually held it in November of 2020, running basically 100% of volunteers. So we held the event successfully. One of the challenges, though, that we had was in addition to running what we call a COVID safe event, so utilizing social distancing, having what we call a COVID marshal from the government, kind of patrolling our event and video recording it for government purposes. So there was an added level of scrutiny when we were running that fundraising event. But it went off without a hitch, I'm happy to say, and we exceeded our fundraising target. Um, because it was an initial event, we only had a small goal of raising $5,000, which we only raised half of that on the evening of the event, and we were basically utilizing a marketing campaign of how do we raise the rest of the fundraising target within the time that we had allocated. Um, so basically, we took to social media and we started asking people, everyone from our partners to people who had liked our Facebook page, to people on LinkedIn, people who are interacting using our website and other online platforms, are basically matching our fundraising goal, dollar for dollar. So we raised almost up to $6,000 within 2 weeks. Um, and it was just a kind of a testament to using virtual volunteering as a model to do that, because all of our volunteers, we didn't know moving into the event, and within our own organization we operate within 100% volunteer model. So outside of our organization, basically people turned up at the event, and then we were utilizing their services um, in real time. So it is a way that we've been able to kind of see it happen effectively within an event, totally utilizing volunteers for fundraising. And as a result of our first successful event last year, we've decided to make it an annual event, which we kind of utilize for volunteers moving forward. So that's just a practical example of how we utilize volunteers locally. Um, but obviously, not every outcome is like that. And when it comes to outcomes versus reality, you kind of have to weigh up, how effective it is for your organization. Uh, it's not to say that it doesn't work, but you have to, obviously, all things considered, how worthwhile is it for your organization? It's something that you have to consider when you do events in person. I know a lot of events now, they're utilizing a hybrid model where, you know, people can obviously be at a physical location and present their fundraising target or their project. And then everyone else, if they're in different locations, can kind of tune in like we're doing today. So those hybrid models have been quite effective. Um, it's not to say that 100% virtual audience can't interact directly with organizations or fundraisers. Um, but sometimes it's inevitable. And I think with the global pandemic, it's kind of shown us that we have to think um, innovatively and creatively in order to meet demand. So it's something that you have to consider when weighing up outcomes, especially long term. So when it comes to utilizing young people, as I mentioned, 13% of the sector are young people aged between 15 to 24. And it's usually, when people are coming outside of university, entering their first jobs. So they're more open to volunteering, which is why so many young people have adapted to virtual volunteering as a viable vehicle or platform to gain practical experience. And it's something that even young professionals, when they enter into, full-time gigs or working professionally, that they still do as kind of their side hustle. Um, so for me, as a project director, obviously running a non-profit organization, I'm employed full-time for the organization, and that's how I get my paycheck. But it's not to say that I don't volunteer in my spare time. So with platforms such as, the Global Shapers, with the World Economic Forum, that's 100% volunteer outside of my own time. When I serve on boards such as, ARMCare, the Australian Refugee and Migrant Care Services, that's a board capacity that's 100% volunteering for my time. Other initiatives I'm involved in, recently I was elected to the US Consulate's Youth Advisory Council for Brisbane. That's a virtual volunteering opportunity, liaising with the US Consulate in Canberra. So it depends on your bandwidth and how many opportunities you can commit to. Um, there are things like volunteer fatigue and burnout that you have to consider um, when utilizing such a model as virtual volunteering, but it's something that we have to kind of strike a balance with. And the more that you engage with the model, the more effective and efficient that you become as well. And I will share more about those organizations I mentioned in a few moments as well. So feel free to ask questions. But basically, as I mentioned, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So what I mean by that is it depends really on your niche market and the fundraising goals that you set for yourself and your organization. So when it comes to the economic downturn, um, different organizations are downsizing. Um, they're looking at the most effective way to utilize the potential of an existing workforce, and even if they're recruiting young professionals or people outside of organizations on a contract basis or even volunteers, they're really looking at less experience and more potential. So that's where volunteering comes into an advantage, because a lot of young people, they may not have the experience, but they definitely have the network or the willingness or uh, the firepower in a sense to utilize obviously virtual volunteering. So it depends on what matters most to your organization, and how much you can utilize from that perspective as well. And I'm conscious of time as well, so I'll kind of skip over more of the details for this so that we can answer questions. But as a final example, as I mentioned, ARMCare, which is an acronym that stands for the Australian Refugee and Migrant Care Services. It's an organization or project born out of my involvement with the World Economic Forum. So it's basically a way that we serve migrants and refugees coming from civil conflicts or coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds or communities in need. Often, when migrants and refugees come to Australia, they don't have the resources or the opportunities to get employment, um, or they're relying on government resources. So, our organization basically offers medical and mental health support services for free. Um, and the NDIS, which is the National Disability Insurance Scheme, is a way that we've utilized a government service to actually pay for our volunteers who are, giving back pro bono. So it's basically the our founder, Dr. Claire Jones, is herself a migrant from South Africa who came to Australia and obviously encountered a lot of challenges from a cultural perspective, but basically founded this organization as a way to give back to her community. And through the efforts of the other board members that I serve with, we've been able to basically save enough funds to make the organization run 100% on contributions from individuals within the nonprofit sector and also other partners that have engaged with us. And recently, we undertook an independent social impact assessment, which valued the organization at in excess of $4 million in savings. So, using your organization, it doesn't matter how many people you have or where you're based or what stage of the nonprofit cycle you're at. Um, you always have a opportunity to expand beyond your sector or your niche market. And I think kind of breaking out of the traditional model of fundraising often helps in that regard. And it definitely helps in getting people to volunteer for your cause as well. So um, I think we have about 10 minutes left. So I'll basically run through these 10 tips that I have to round out our presentation for today. But basically, these are tips that I put together based on how do we utilize young people for fundraising in the midst of a pandemic. So knowing your why is basically understanding the purpose for your organization and kind of getting back to the basics of why you exist and how you're contributing to the sector that you're in. That's a key question that you have to kind of consider when you're utilizing virtual volunteering. Understanding your target market is kind of a given, but obviously when you're working in a niche market or you're a small organization, how do you kind of understand the changing trends? Obviously with the pandemic, kind of thinking outside of your own market and breaking into and to new markets is often something that you have to consider as well. Um, and I will give a list of resources for platforms that you can kind of break into if you are a nonprofit that's looking into that, those sorts of opportunities. The third tip I would say is getting the right people. So virtual volunteering really helps in this process. So, platforms, as I mentioned, like Volley, getting skilled young professionals to join your organization or your project or your initiative really helps to navigate you through a crisis such as COVID. So that's something to consider. Finding your community. This is really crucial because for nonprofits that are looking to expand beyond just a local nonprofit or national nonprofit into more of a global community, really finding your tribe is very important. So platforms that you can utilize to do that. I know the World Economic Forum, we have about 400 hubs in over 150 countries. So we often collaborate with different hubs in different countries if we have a similar idea or project that we want young professionals to collaborate with. That's something that we do. And sometimes you don't have to be intimidated by people outside of your space. I've collaborated with people from the World Economic Forum who are on the Fortune 40 under 40 list. They've been recognized by the UN. They've spoken, um, at major conferences and events. But we've connected because we have or we're part of the same community. So I think kind of finding your tribe in that regard is important. Um, just skipping through these. So collaborating across boundaries, I think I touched on that before. Kind of looking outside of your own network and looking beyond just the market that you're part of, and obviously tapping into those markets, especially. Upskilling your talent pool, as I mentioned, kind of looking at different courses that you can do online. And I think Hila has a number of courses that you can look at when you're upskilling, and young professionals especially are very open to upskilling when it comes to obviously looking into virtual volunteering and kind of updating their skills or resumes as well. Thinking long term, as I mentioned, the pandemic is probably going to be around for at least the next couple of months to the next couple of years. That's not to say that we have a bleak outlook on the way things are changing within the economy, but it's something that we have to consider, as I mentioned, when you look at models like virtual volunteering. Um, how do we kind of adapt those initiatives or the vehicles um, for volunteers into our long-term strategy from a fundraising perspective? And it's really a no-brainer when it comes to fundraising because there's no out-of-pocket expenses when you're utilizing volunteers apart from training, which you'd probably do with a candidate if you hired them anyway. So the cost to your organization or your bottom line is not substantive enough to obviously um, consider it or to disregard virtual volunteering. So I think that's something to consider when you're convincing your organization, if you're not running a nonprofit yourself, or you need to get the tick of approval from your organization. It's something to consider as well. Um, Pursuing new ideas, as I mentioned before, platforms such as Hope Squad were born out of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's something that we've had to obviously consider moving forward when thinking post-pandemic now, and kind of using the virtual volunteering model long term. So I like to say, don't reinvent the wheel, just make it better. So obviously try and collaborate outside of ideas that you might not have yourself, or utilizing platforms that are out there, such as Volunteer Match, or Volley or other platforms as well, just to get, creative ideas and your creative juices flowing when it comes to fundraising. Finding valuable mentors. I can't stress this enough. That mentors that have helped me within the World Economic Forum, within my own organization. Online mentoring is becoming quite popular. We've recently collaborated with QBuddy, which is short for Quarantine Buddy, is born out of a university in the States, and has now collaborated or connected um, mentors and mentees across 100 countries. And it's featured in Time magazine. So there's a lot of different ways that you can connect with mentors within your space or even outside of your market. That is basically like an accountability partner to give you advice or become a sounding board when it comes to models such as virtual volunteering and accessing key resources. And I'll share this in the chat and obviously offline. There are a lot of initiatives locally, if you're here in Australia, that you can access. Info Exchange, um, which is basically a technology organization for social justice, is about to launch their digital hub in June. We've unofficially partnered with them to basically provide resources, courses, upskilling platforms for organizations within the nonprofit sector. As I mentioned, PwC, one of the big four accounting firms, launched Project Spirit. You can access that online and basically post any organization or opportunity from your organization that people want to get involved in um, for volunteering purposes. Volley, as I mentioned, which has been around for over a decade, even before the pandemic, is a great way for people to get involved using the virtual volunteering model. And as a short plug for our organization, Solve Squad, we usually list one new organization we're highlighting on our platform per week that's utilizing the virtual volunteering model. So feel free to check us out on solvesquad.co or check out our ReachAcross website for more information. So that brings us to the end of my presentation, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so much as well. That was inspiring. I think that volunteering has definitely been a bit of a sticking point with COVID. So it's always great to see that there are innovative ways to bring people back into the fold. I did see that we had some questions. I saw that you answered the ones from Philip in the chat, but if we go over to the Q&A, this one is from an anonymous attendee. Many millennials and working class folks have time constraints. So how can I make my volunteering program more flexible?
Definitely, yeah, that's a great question from Anonymous. I think definitely when it comes to flexibility, you have to consider, your bandwidth and obviously the bandwidth of other volunteers. Everyone has, either passion projects or, full-time jobs that, you have to juggle. So how do you kind of meet those time constraints? That's a great question. I think when it comes to projects, it's a bit easier because you have a specific timeline where you can say to your virtual volunteer, hey, we have 3 to 6 months that we have to meet this fundraising target or this project initiative. How can I work around your schedule or your timeline to make this happen? And I think just being really upfront with volunteers is key because, if you're all on the same page before you even enter into an agreement or a virtual volunteering relationship, that's really helpful for the long-term, viability of your project or your platform. So I think just being flexible in general and kind of having the same objectives in mind really helps when it comes to time constraints as well.
Absolutely. And I think that could be applied across not just volunteering, but almost every role of the not-for-profit.
Definitely, yeah.
The last question, just before we wrap things up, is how do you show your volunteers appreciation virtually?
Yeah, this is a great question as well. We've actually partnered with an organization called Social Table. So they basically utilize, platforms such as Zoom or Meet, Google Hangout or Meet, um, or even if you're using Teams, things like that, to kind of facilitate the virtual volunteering process from a benefits perspective. So if people are meeting targets or kind of exceeding expectations, Social Table basically steps in and shows appreciation by giving prizes or rewarding volunteers with non-monetary incentives. So things from sending like care packages to with Easter coming up, sending Easter hampers or sending gift cards. There's often ways that you can do that virtually, with Amazon you can always send virtual gift cards as well. There are ways to kind of get people to buy in if there's bonuses within your organization, or doing shout outs on, team calls, things like that. So there's different ways that you can, show appreciation for your volunteers. But I think just at the bottom line, making them feel welcome, included, part of your team, whether they're a contractor or a virtual volunteer that's kind of coming in for a short period of time. I think just making sure that they're valued and appreciated from the get-go really helps to kind of build that brand awareness and loyalty, and engage them from your organization's perspective as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I think we will wind things down. That includes the session. So thank you so much, Joseph. You've given us some great takeaways for our own outreach and volunteer programs.